Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining me. My name is Brandon Melchor. I am locally known as a communications coach. I have a shared position between the Writing Center and the College of Business. And today I'm here to talk to you guys a little bit about business plans, right? So we can go ahead and kick it into gear because we have a lot of ground to cover and I like to ramble sometimes.
And I wanted to tell you, thank you so much, Brandon, for coming. Brandon, really quickly, Brandon Melchor is working as the Integrated Academic Support Specialist, which is a shared position between the Writing Center and the College of Business, colloquially known as a communications coach, okay? His stated mission is to establish a space for RCD Kobe students to feel comfortable engaging more deeply with writing and gain lifelong communication skills. He's partnered with RCD Kobe faculty and other staff to pilot a range of writing workshops and other support initiatives for students. Thank you so much, Brandon. Take it away.
All right, so like I was talking about before, this workshop is designed to go over a lot of the basics, right? This is a two-part workshop. So it's designed to lay a lot of groundwork in this first half, and then in the other half, we would delve into a lot more specific. So going over a lot of the basics of business plan writing, and then also some strategies for coping with what can sometimes be, a long and intensive and sometimes very intimidating process. The breakdown is 4 major sections. I'm going to be going into what makes academic writing and business writing different, right? Going to talk about some guidelines for a business plan. Going to delve a little bit into the writing process, and then also I'm going to share some strategies for coping with intensive writing. I'm going to go ahead and just launch off. What we're going to begin with is a question about genre. So I'm going to ask you guys to participate a little bit. I want you guys to go ahead and name a genre. Just any genre that comes to mind. First thing you think of when you hear the word genre. Horror. Thriller. Rom-com. Hip hop, yes. Fiction, that's a good one. Does anyone on Zoom have any participation? Chat. Just anything you guys can think of that you would be considered a genre. They're not talking on Zoom yet. Grant writing, a type of style. Yeah, it's sort of like a type of style. I'll get into it a little bit. So when we talk about genre, oftentimes we think about media, right? We think of movies, TVs, books, right? We got horror, comedy, all of this stuff. But actually, genre is something that exists all around us, right? Academic writing is itself a genre, right? You have research papers, essays, reports, stuff like that, as well as business writing. Business writing is a genre. Emails, memos, business plans, right, are a genre within business writing. So when we're thinking about this word genre, right, it applies to basically any kind of writing that we do. And having an understanding of the genre helps you more effectively communicate your ideas, right? If you understand what makes a business plan, right, like the genre of it, the shape of that genre, then your writing will be more effective and you'll have a smoother process writing. So I think the most writing experience you guys have is academic writing. I'm going to be using that as a jumping off point. So I'll be talking about some similarities and some differences. So when we're talking about these two different kinds of writing, there is a lot that they have in common, but then there are some very important differences as well. So we'll be starting with what they have in common. So first, they're both formal. What that means is they are both very professional, right? Academic, if you want to think of it that way. That means no spelling errors, right? Like it needs to be, no spelling errors, no slang, right? There's like these high expectations for the kind of language you use, the kind of structure you give, right? It needs to be arranged very well, right? It can't be casual, right? There are some very heavy expectations. They are both objective. And when I say objective, I'm talking mostly in like content, but also in tone, right? Academic writing, and business writing, they both tend to be very sort of distant, right? Like when you're, especially in a business plan, right? When you're talking about your business, you're usually not saying like I or we, you're usually most often using the name of the business, right? So, and we'll be talking a little bit more about perspective in a little bit, but this is like the things that these genres value the most, right? Factualness, factuality, right? In both academic and business writing, you need to have research, right? Whether that's market research, whether that's market analysis, it's very, very important that you use numbers, right? And you make sure you use the right numbers from the right sources, right? All of that stuff. And they both have a primacy on originality. It needs to be your work, right? In class, you'll often probably hear that, right? When you have to write an essay, right? No plagiarism, no copying, right? You have to write it yourself. And when it comes to business writing, that's important because it's about ownership of those ideas, right? You need to be able to prove that not only do you understand how your business works, that you can communicate it to other people. Because even if you, right, have an amazing idea in your head, if you cannot communicate that, then you won't be able to convince anybody to invest or to join as a business partner or whatever your goal is. And they are both authoritative. So this is driven mostly from objectivity, right? That just means that you are supposed to sound confident in your writing, right? It's supposed to come with this air of, I know what I'm talking about, I have expertise, right? It's very, very important in both of these kinds of writing to sort of show that you know what you're talking about, right? And so when we get into the differences, academic writing often comes with complex structure, right? Like especially if you look at like journals and stuff like that, they use like a lot of jargon, a lot of technical words, right? And that's because the purpose of academic writing is to communicate often very complex ideas, right? So by nature, they have to be complex. Where business writing differs is it needs to be efficient, right? Especially in terms of communication, right? Like emails, memos, stuff like that. You don't want to be long-winded, right? These are supposed to be short, very to the point, right? Direct, but in the size of the writing, essentially. And then we're talking about tone. Academic writing is very candid, and by that I just mean it's straightforward, right? This is what's like if it's a study, right? This is what's happening, right? There's not a lot of room for niceties, right? It's just this is what it is, because it's very scientific. Business writing, on the other hand, often uses a cordial tone, right? There's a lot, you need to be polite, you need to be deferential, right? And also empathetic, right? Very, service oriented. And the reason that is because this cordial, empathetic, service oriented style is effective for getting things moving, right? Because it's about that efficiency. You need to maintain cordiality because you want this person to respond and talk to you. Or in the case of business plans, right, you want them to respond positively. So it's very, very important to sort of keep those wheels moving. Academic writing is very rigid in terms of structure as well. That just means that like it has like an abstract and then very specific structures. And if you look at multiple different like essays and research papers and stuff like that, it won't change. But with business writing, it's a little more flexible, right? Because it is a little more interpersonal, right? It's more about just meeting someone where they're at and trying to convince them. It's a little more flexible. And so if you like look at multiple different business plans, right? If you go and you find credible sources, you'll find that they follow a general structure, but sometimes they don't always, right? Sometimes they remove a section, sometimes they don't spend as much time as others do. So there's that like flexibility in terms of structure. Does anyone have any questions so far?
Will you be showing us some examples?
I won't be getting into examples this time, because we have a lot of general information to go over. But in the second workshop is when I would be delving into like specific examples, talking about what makes them good, and maybe what doesn't make them so good.
Okay,
Anyone else? Okay, so now we'll be delving into a little bit more on the guidelines for business plan writing. So here we'll be going over the sections of a business plan. This is just going to be a broad overview of each of the major sections and like your goal when you are writing. So on the title page, right, it's pretty straightforward. It's just the company name and some basic information, right? It's just so that you tell the audience, what the business is and where it's located, basic information. In the executive summary, this is where you talk a little bit more about it in depth, right? Introduce some of that basic information, background, this is where you include your mission statement, and then you can also include some measures for success, right? And then in the next section, company description, right? Talk more about the mission, goals, objectives of the company, what you hope to accomplish, right? Market analysis, right? This is where you want to present a strong understanding of your target market and your market outlook, right? This is where you'll be relying heavily on research to prove that there is a place for your business to not only exist, but to grow and to prosper, all that good stuff. And then organization and management is where you will outline the structure and management of your company, right? This is where you talk about who works there, what are they doing, and sort of giving some details on how it's structured. Service or product line is where you present it, right? So you just talk about what service or product you're doing, right? What you can talk more about what niche it sort of fills. And then marketing and sales is where you describe how your company will reach its customer base, as well as the transaction process. Please forgive me, this is just a bit of housekeeping so that we all have that basic understanding of what a business plan is. The funding request is where you explain how much funding your company will need and then how the funds will be used. You want to be very specific here, right? If the audience is the people giving you the money, they want to know how you're going to use it. And then we have financial projection. This is just where you provide up to the next 5 years of the financials of your company, right? This is where you want to put like if you're going, how you're going to grow and stuff like that. And then we have the appendix where you provide other supporting documents, right? If you already have some sales figures you want to share and stuff like that, that is where you would put it. And then the next question is who am I writing for, right? And this answer is a little bit twofold when you're writing a business plan. So you are writing this business plan for yourself, right? It is sort of a guidepost, right? You are planning out how the business will function and how it will grow, right? You'll be hammering out those details sort of as you write it, right? So it's supposed to be sort of this guiding document that even after you start your business, you can go back and you can look at and make sure that you are like clearly following that mission and those goals that you set and you are sort of functioning as you originally intended. But also you're writing for your audience, right? And it's twofold. So you're writing one to inform the audience of your business, right? Giving them those nitty-gritty details, but you're also trying to convince them to invest, right? In this case, if you're interested in, or if you're participating in the business plan competition, right? You need to be thinking about those panelists, right? What they expect, what they're gonna want from you, what they're gonna want to see. And if you're maybe planning on becoming an entrepreneur in the future, right? You need to think about if you're going to be getting loans, right? If you're gonna be showing this business plan to banks, angel investors, right? Friends, family, other people you might know in the community, right? So it's always important to keep that audience at the forefront of your mind. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later too. So now we're going to talk a bit about perspective, right? This is one of those things where we all kind of learn about perspective, right? But maybe they don't really tell you much about like why perspective matters. And so we have first person perspective, which is I or we, second person you, and then third person he, she, they. Oh, do we have we could probably share the presentation
There.
afterwards with the participants.
Yes.
Okay. So, sorry, to get back on track. So these are the different kinds of perspectives, right? And so why do they matter? So the main reason they matter is the kind of tone and focus they provide. So when you write in that first person perspective, you are centering the writing on yourself, right? Typically in formal writing, both academic and in business, plan specifically, you want to avoid this, right? Traditionally avoiding both first person and second person perspective, because those sort of acknowledge the relationship between the writer and the audience, right? So there's not that distance between them. You make the relationship very close. You'll often see this stuff, and you'll often see second person perspective in stuff like advertising, right? Because it's about establishing that connection with the audience. In business plans though, like the general expectation is that you avoid that acknowledgement, right? And then the main reason we focus on third person perspective is because it creates that objective tone, right? You're putting that distance between the audience and the reader, or the audience and the writer, and so it makes you a little more credible, right? Because then you're writing, it sounds like you are a little less personal, right? It didn't sound like how do I put it? So yeah, it just makes you, the best example I can share is, have you guys ever watched like a nature documentary, right? Like with David Attenborough. When he is talking, he is not acknowledging that relationship between you, the viewer, and him, the narrator. He is simply describing the events as they happen. And so that is what objectivity means, right? It's just simply explaining how your business works and how it's going to function and grow and all of that good stuff. But it's from that sort of distant perspective, outside looking in, because that's also the perspective that the audience has, right? They are an outsider to your business. You might have a lot of passion and a lot of care, right? But if these are the people who are investing in you, right? They want to see returns. So they don't care as much about, passion and stuff like that. Maybe they don't even care about the industry you work in, right? Which can happen. That's why maintaining objectivity gives you credibility, because then you are acknowledging that outside perspective and then answering those questions and providing just the fact that you understand that someone is reading this and you're meeting their needs. The big thing in business plans is remaining grounded and remaining positive, right? So like I talked about before, you need to use facts, you need to use numbers, you need to use data, statistics, but you also need to remain positive, right? So if we have these two things that we need to sort of have at the same time, how might we balance them? Does anyone have an idea of how you would do that kind of balancing act?
You can take the information presented factually, compare it to your industry, your value proposition, and then present it in a opportunistic manner that may leverage potential funding.
Absolutely. Does anyone else have any kind of idea for how they might balance this?
I don't know if this is what you're getting at necessarily, but I would imagine, for example, to remain grounded, not like being, I guess, overly positive or optimistic, and not like, oh yeah, everyone needs my thing, everyone's gonna buy it, and I'm gonna make $1 million in the first year, right? Like being an extreme example.
Yeah,
But also, obviously, you're not gonna want or benefit from any doom and gloom either. So that's the balance you're talking about, maybe?
yeah, that's what I'm sort of getting at. So it's that sort of push and pull of you need to sort of prove that your business will succeed, but you don't want to oversell it, right? Because it's another one of those things where we set audience expectations in our writing. So if you do oversell and then you can't actually deliver on that, then you're sort of undermining your own credibility. And then use the tone. Yeah, absolutely. So I have 3 answers for this question. Use detail, use detail, use detail. This is something that I think can be the biggest trap. It's great, right? If you have passion and a lot of care, right? Maybe you do believe that everyone needs your product, right? And that you can make $1 million. Again, from that audience perspective, you need to prove it, right? So you need to have the projections and the numbers to back that up, and they need to be grounded, right? They need to have good sources, it needs to be well researched. And so if you find that the research isn't backing up as much as you are selling, perhaps, then it might just mean, sort of pulling back and remaining more grounded in terms of what you are offering, right? It can be a little bit hard finding that balance, and so that's why it always needs to be based in reality. But yeah, and then if you believe your business will be successful, which you should, that will show in the numbers and in that positive tone, right? You can be hopeful and you can be, you can believe that you will succeed, and then you can also prove it. So it's always making sure that the numbers back up what you're actually promising. So another concept I want to share with you guys is the idea of pitying the reader. Like I talked about before, they need to be at the forefront of your mind whenever you're writing. Because partially you are writing for yourself, but you're writing for your audience. And so these are some of the things that you need to keep in mind when you're writing. So of course, write about what matters to you, right? Obviously, if it's a business that you are passionate about, then that is already covered, right? But it's just about making that writing meaningful and impactful, right? Showing why it matters, right? Just to you, and then hopefully getting that audience to also care, right? It's one of those things where that sort of genuineness is really, really good. Right, and you shouldn't do something. This might be a controversial piece of advice, but you shouldn't do something if you don't believe in it, right? I think right now there's a pretty big explosion of like AI, right? But it's not something that you just want to throw in there because everyone else is doing it, right? If you don't actually have passion for AI, if you don't actually care about how it's going to help you like grow. If you're like, well, everyone else is doing it, so I'll just throw it in there and then I'll figure it out later. That's the kind of trap you want to avoid, because that will become obvious to the reader that you don't actually care that much about AI. You're just hopping on the bandwagon because you think it can help you, right? But then maybe you haven't actually thought it through as much. And then that will show in the writing. Don't ramble, right? Like I talked about before, business writing is extremely efficient. Right? And it comes in that balancing act, right? Because it is supposed to be authoritative and factual. A lot of students especially will run into the trap of seeing, especially academic writing, right? It's very intelligent, right? And then they will try to emulate that like complex structure of academic writing without actually understanding like how or why it works, right? So do not fall into that trap. Do not, write, do not use big words that you don't understand, right? Do not make your sentences longer than they need to be. Because if at any point your audience goes, well, why are your sentences so long, right? These are hard to read, you're using jargon, it doesn't even seem like you even know what you're talking about enough. You immediately undermine your credibility. So just do your best when you're writing not to ramble. And keep it simple, right? Just again, who is reading this and what do they know? Only tell them what they need to know. If they don't need, if you're writing, right, maybe you ask a friend to like take a look at it, and they go, well, hey, why did you have this here? And you can't give them a proper answer, then you should probably just remove it. Because even if they're not your primary audience, if it's something that's confusing or doesn't make sense or you can't explain, then chances are your intended audience, those panelists, those banks, those investors, they will have that same question and then you'll be stuck in a place where you can't answer it. And have the guts to cut. Even if you've worked really, really hard on this business plan, right, which I'm sure you guys will, you have to cut. It's that same thing where if something doesn't make sense or something just isn't flowing right or something just doesn't seem feasible, you need to cut it, right? And this might mean, like in the writing process, that you discover some part of your business maybe doesn't work like you thought it would, or you just can't find the right way to say it. You might need to cut it and replace it with something else or shift your priorities, right? It's just important to keep in mind that you need to remain flexible when you're writing. And sound like yourself. So this can be hard to do, right? When we're talking about that like third person to second and first person perspective. So it's about making use of your voice in appropriate and effective ways, right? So the majority of your business plan should be written in that third person perspective. If you want to throw in the I or even the you sometimes, if you look at some examples, they will have it. You need to be thinking about the impact it will have on your audience, right? Is it good for me to include an I here in there? Because then, again, it shows that ownership over those ideas, right? And maybe you do want to close the distance with that audience, right? But it needs to be an intentional sort of rhetorical choice, right? It needs to be convincing or impactful, right? You shouldn't just be using I or we because that's what you're most comfortable with. You should be thinking about, again, how the audience is going to receive that. If they are, longtime business investors, right, then maybe you want to just keep that third person objective tone because they're not going to react well to any semblance of I or you or anything like that. And maybe if you think your audience would react to that a little bit better, then you can include it. But it's about keeping an image of your audience in mind. And say what you mean. Again, this is about that conciseness and that brevity, right? If your audience ever goes, what are you saying here? I don't even know, then you've already lost them, right? So you want to make sure when you're writing that you're constantly asking yourself from that audience's perspective, what, why, how, when, where, because and if you can sort of preempt those questions, if you can ask them before the audience does, you can give those answers, and then that will make your writing all the more effective. So sort of broad overview of everything I've talked about. This is, I like to call this filling the gap in business writing. So the gap I'm talking about and referring here is not a gap in ability or anything like that. It's specifically, I think, just more a gap in mindset. Right, so we're talking about genre, audience, purpose. That's the gap, right? The genre is business plans. It has all those structures and expectations and the way you're supposed to write it. You have your audience, right, which is very, very important, right? It's the people who are going to be reading it, right? The people you need to make care. And then you have your purpose, which, if you're writing a business plan, is usually to get investment, right? You're trying to get money of some kind. And so the relationship between all these three things is something you need to keep in mind when you're writing as well. Just what are the expectations, right? Are those expectations the expectations of the audience? And then how am I meeting those expectations or using them to reach my purpose? So these are all sort of interconnected and they all feed into each other. You can't think about one without thinking about the other. So this is something that I think is really, really helpful in sort of making sure your writing is purposeful and impactful and powerful. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the writing process. Another question for you guys. Do you guys know what the writing process is? Can I get a show of hands? Yes, even if it's just vaguely. Yes. Does anyone in the chat think they know? Or not really? An answer from Aaron. Outline drafting, first draft, final draft, something like that, right? Brainstorming as the first step, right? This is another one of those things where maybe you kind of heard it, like in English 1301, right? But maybe it just didn't stick, right? It happens. So to talk about the writing process a little bit, this is what it is, right? There's 4 major steps to the writing process: pre-writing, drafting, revising, and editing, right? So this is a general guideline, and I'm gonna talk about it for quite a while, so I hope you guys are strapped in. Pre-writing involves everything you do before you actually write. So this is most typically brainstorming, right? But that can also include, just thinking in your head, maybe just free writing, right? Just writing ideas out on a piece of paper. Oftentimes it's helpful to use a graphic organizer, right? So you maybe plan out like what you're going to be writing, like list those major bullet points, or just writing things you think are important, right? That's all of this stuff is vital to getting started, right? Research is a part of pre-writing, right? Because when you're reading those journal articles or whatever you're doing, you're also thinking about what you're going to be writing. Taking notes, right? As you're reading, taking notes, even just talking to other people, right? Maybe you just want to say like, hey, I have a business plan, I haven't really gotten started yet. And you're just gonna talk to one of your friends and family about kind of what ideas you have, right? What you want to write down. And although pre-writing is the first thing you will do, right? The generation of ideas can come at any stage, right? And that's another reason it's important to remain flexible. You can maybe get like 65% of the way through writing it, and then you have an idea, right? And then now it's a matter of fitting that idea into the existing business plan that you've written, right? That's why it's so important to remain flexible. Drafting is the beginnings of writing, right? Some people will just start pre-writing, right? They will just, open up a Word document and just start typing. Some people need to plan it out, right? Some people don't. In this early stage, from pre-writing to drafting, if you find yourself having a hard time getting started, it's probably because you did not complete enough pre-writing, right? You didn't do enough research, you didn't look at enough examples of other business plans, right? You just weren't quite ready to get drafted. So even though this is a straight line, it's important to remember that sometimes looping back can be really, really helpful. And so this drafting stage is where you start writing it out, connecting ideas, like establishing the structure. It's important here to not get too caught up on stuff like spelling, and like the structure and stuff like that. Just get your ideas out on paper, right? You can draft in different orders, right? You don't have to write like from the beginning of the business plan to the end. You can write different sections at different times, right? It's just important to make sure you're moving forward. And then once you've gotten your first draft, right? This is where you will begin revision. And the key thing about revision is that, and I'll mention it later, but the key process of revision is involving major changes to the structure, the format, right? Again, this is the stage where you've written it, right? Maybe you step away for a couple of days, you come back, and now you're getting that clean pair of eyes on it. And then this is where you remain open to, oh, maybe I need to move this around. Maybe maybe these numbers belong earlier, right? Maybe, or it's more effective if I include these numbers sooner because that's what the audience cares about, right? This is the stage where you need to remain open to just changing that overall structure, rearranging things, cutting chunks out, moving them around, right? This is where you sort of, you can end up reconstituting your Frankenstein monster of an essay. So yeah, this is just where you start. The drafting stage is very writer-centric, right? You're just getting your ideas out on paper. And then the revision stage after you've gotten that first draft is where you start thinking about the audience, right? Thinking, what can I change to make it better, to make it easier to read, right? To make it make more sense, to make it simpler, right? What can I cut out? What can I, what can I add in more of, right? It's that sort of stage, right, where you're making those big to little changes. And then once you feel satisfied with the overall structure, organization, right, you feel like this is like a pretty good business plan, like I'm like 95% of the way there, that's where you move to editing, right? You don't want to focus on stuff like grammar and sentence structure and stuff like that too much before the very end. Because what can often happen is if you're too focused on those like little tiny details, you can miss some of the bigger stuff, right? A spelling error here or there is not as important as the overall structure and organization of your business plan, right? So you don't want to lose the forest for the trees, so to speak. And so in the editing stage is where you will check for stuff like grammar, punctuation, making sure that you are maintaining that like third person perspective, right? And it just make sure you don't do this stage of the writing until you're at the very end. Yeah. And so discovering your writing process. So the writing process I lined out is more of a general overview. Everyone's writing process is different. Some people don't need to do any writing, right? They don't need to do any like outlining, and then they just start writing and they can go from there and it can be very, very smooth. Some people need to plan a lot, right? I need to plan out basically every major bullet point, every major paragraph of this business plan before I actually write it out. So it's important to understand what works for you the most. And also keep in mind, writing is non-linear, right? There is no straightforward path through the writing process typically, right? If you find yourself like something just doesn't stick, right? Something doesn't work, it just doesn't flow in the right way you want it to. There are strategies you can use to overcome those blocks, right? One thing I'll mention is reverse outlining. Let's say you have most of it written out and you are just stuck, right? You just can't finish it and you don't know why. Then you would want to do some reverse outlining. So that just means that you would go back through what you've already written and create those like major bullet point outline. And then that will give you that broader overview that you might have been missing. And then you can move forward or overcome those hurdles. But yeah, and another thing I will stress, revision is not editing, right? A large portion of making writing effective is revision, is making those big changes when you need to. So don't get caught up on editing too much until the very end. And so here are some strategies for coping with intensive writing. Writing under pressure. Obviously, right, if you're planning on participating in this competition, or you are maybe planning on becoming an entrepreneur, right? You're here because you want to know how business plan writing works and you want to sort of move forward. It can be a lot of stress, right? Deadlines come up, right? Then we have to juggle. So writing under pressure, right, it can be very, very difficult, right? To even just sit down and start writing, right? Or to even think about it. Especially if maybe you haven't had the best experiences with writing, you don't think of yourself as a writer. So these are some things that you want to do to sort of overcome that initial sort of fear and intimidation of all that pressure, right? Avoid procrastinating. If it is something where the deadline is coming very, very soon, right? For example, the business plan is due, I think, like March 15th, right? So you have a little over a month if you are participating. Right, that can be stressful, right? It can be a lot to think about, right? There's a lot on the line. So making sure you're not procrastinating. So if you have that little guilty feeling in the back of your head, right? Like I should be writing, but I'm not. That is a problem because what that does is it stops the writing process, right? Because you feel guilty, you want to avoid it. And so then you end up pushing it away, not wanting to do it, right? It sort of happens to everyone, but just making sure you sit down at the very least, probably more, but at the very least 15 minutes a day, just sitting down and just getting something down, writing, right? Setting that commitment, you'll eventually sort of ingrain in yourself that habit, and then it'll help you overcome that pressure, right? It'll feel a little less stressful when you've gotten something done. Look at examples, right? Look at guides from credible sources, look at other business plan examples and stuff like that. Just as long as you're not avoiding the topic, then you will be making progress, right? And drawing from multiple credible sources, right? Looking at them, using them as a model for effective business writing. It'll bolster your own, right? Of course, outlining is always great if there's a lot of pressure, right? Even if you've already started writing, maybe you started writing without an outline, go in and create an outline after the fact, even though you're already halfway in the essay. And writing is collaborative. Ask for feedback, right? Ask for someone, friends, family, colleagues, if it's appropriate, just ask them to take a look, ask them for feedback, ask them what they think. And it's important to make sure that you take whatever feedback you get with a grain of salt, right? And you accept it with the right mindset, right? Getting multiple different perspectives is great, right? But you don't want to sort of muddy the waters. But it can be helpful for sort of overcoming, those like sort of mental blocks. Writing is a very cognitive process, right? It involves a lot of thinking. And if it's painful to think about it, then you're kind of stopping yourself. So overcoming writer's block. Let's see. So this is going to sound a little counterintuitive, but let's say you've been writing for like 45 minutes, right? And you're stuck. You just can't move forward and you don't know what to do. Oftentimes, the best thing to do is to step away, right? Again, writing is a cognitive process and it is a subconscious process, right? Sometimes maybe you just haven't, it's a situation where you just haven't given yourself enough time to process what you've read or sort of giving yourself time to think about like how you're going to turn your thoughts into writing. So stepping away can be something as small as getting a drink or a snack, just take like a quick 5-minute break, right? Do some chores around the house if you're at home, right? Clean something, rearrange your whole living room, just something to keep your mind off of it. Run errands if you need to, or maybe even take a nap. Maybe you're just too tired and you need a little refresher. The important thing to remember is, as long as it's not procrastination, right? As long as you're as long as you have the right mindset, stepping away can be really, really helpful, and it can sort of give your brain time to process, what you're trying to accomplish. Take a walk. Yeah, absolutely. Review what you've written at. That isn't updated appropriately. Looking at what you've written before will help you, sort of reviewing what you've written before will help you sort of get back on track, right? If you've been derailed, but you've already stepped away, maybe you come back and it's something still not clicking, just reread what you've read, look at other examples, just make sure that you are trying to move forward. And just return later, right? Let's say you don't want to step away, right? But you're stuck on the executive summary or some other part, right? Then just step away, right? From that section and just write something else, right? Insert some figures, insert some numbers if you have those, right? Just write something else, right? It's just a matter of moving forward and making progress. Maintaining the right mindset is always key. Writing, right? Oftentimes we think that there are good writers, bad writers. I'm not a writer, but that's simply not true. Writing itself is not a natural process, right? It is something that can be learned, and then something that it's a skill that can be honed, right? So it might take some time to build up those skills to where you really want them, but it's important to remember that you are learning and you are growing and you are improving. That sort of self-affirmation is very, very important to avoiding getting stuck. And practice makes persuasive. So that was the end of my rambling. So let me see how much time we have left. We have about 8 minutes or more, so that means we have plenty of time for the activity. Okay, so if you guys go ahead and pull out your phones, you can join menti.com if you use that code. So we're going to be doing a few interactions. What I have here are some sort of sample sentences from hypothetical business plans. So I want you guys to look at them, think about everything we've talked about, right? What would go into good business plan writing, and then order them from most appropriate to least appropriate, right? What would look best in a business plan from what would look worst. And then we'll get to see what everyone thinks all together. Take a minute, think about it. I think we've gotten most answered. I think these are some interesting results. Traditionally, number 2 would actually be the most appropriate, right? If we're talking like very, very strictly like old style business plan writing, right? It's that third person perspective, right? You're using, you're not talking I or we, you're talking about yourself as if you were looking from the outside. That doesn't mean, yes.
So then I have a question, see, that one tripped me up because of the one word delicious. Because I thought that's a really subjective thing to say, so for me, it was a toss up because of that one word.
Same.
Yes.
I felt the same way.
Yeah, it is a bit of a trap. That's the thing with writing too, is there is no one answer, right? Between sentence 1 and 2, someone might not even think about the whole delicious, right? Or it might really bother them, right? And you might catch it right away. So this is more an example to show that like, writing is almost never perfect, right? So it's about picking what you think works best in the given situation. So these are all kind of trick questions, so I apologize for that.
Okay.
I know-
We
I-
see you.
Yes,
Brandon.
in writing there's usually never a clean and clear answer, right? So it's about as long as you're thinking. What's the next one?
Oh, that's super biased.
So just order them, read them closely, order them in the way you think is most appropriate. You struggle between 2 and 3. People aren't sure.
Really nice. Gotta follow along.
We have most answered. So this one, yeah, I think the number 1 answer is pretty obvious, and then it's that 2 and 3, I think is where it's interesting. If you're writing a business plan, you probably shouldn't say that you'll only follow most regulations. That's not a good impression to leave. So again, it's about what the audience will see, right? And it's one of those things where, you know, this is kind of an exaggerated example, but thinking about like those little implications that we have when we write, the message we're sending, and then the message that comes across from the audience. So I think technically number 3 would be better. It's not appropriate, but at least we're not admitting to crimes. So that's the big thing. Okay, one more of the order, and then we're gonna move into something a little more intensive. And these are also a little out of context, so it can be tough. Everyone's waiting to see what everyone else thinks. See if you thought right, see if you picked the right answer.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's pretty obvious, right? Number one answer, it's clear, it's specific, it's third person, it's objective, all that good stuff. Number two, not as ideal, maybe you feel like you've said mid-valley recycling too many times, right? So maybe in that situation, the company works better, because it's a little less fatiguing. I've said writing maybe like 1,000 times in this presentation, so sometimes, just saying something different can be helpful for sort of refreshing and keeping things new. And obviously number three is the worst, because it's not even specific, right? Like Donna through Mercedes, who even knows, right? So I think that was pretty straightforward. So moving forward, we will be doing a little bit of writing, so we can look forward to that. So here is the sentence, right? In the context of a business plan, how would you rewrite this to make it better? And better in this context just means, how you think it would be worded. And you can get creative if you want. And then everyone's answers will be shared up the big screen for everyone to look at. But it is anonymous, so no one's getting graded. I really like some of the answers you guys have provided. We can see some examples, right? It's just like some people sort of addressed it in different ways, right? Mostly remove the I, right? Because that is sort of been a little inappropriate. But even claiming something like the best tacos in the valley, it can be a little bit, much, right? It's that little bit over positive tone. So some people dealt with that by just removing, right, best, right? Or just, we strive to make great tacos. We take pride in the food we make, right? Some people answered that with more, a little more detail, right? A little more explanation on like what they mean when they say best. Best selling, that if you have the numbers to prove that, that's also fine to say too, right? So it's about making sure that we're that sort of grounded, right? If you don't have the numbers to back it up, you maybe want to pull back up. Yeah, I think these are also really interesting ways of sort of and or sort of improving that. And you can see that it sort of branches off in many different directions. So yeah, it's just one of those things about writing is even when you make improvements, sometimes you can still make further improvements.
I see one was a little more slanted in the first person,
Yeah,
so we just have to be careful to not do that.
yeah, I would say if you're not confident in business writing, if you're not confident in business plan writing, avoid it, right? Because it's one of those things where, like, if you don't really know, you know how to use an ingredient, right, you're gonna mess up the dish. So it's like that. If it's not that rhetorical, powerful, impactful choice, you should avoid it. I feel like we still have a couple more, but. Yeah, I want to highlight one real quick. But you know, that example, it's a little casual, it's a little too casual, right? It comes across as very like complaining, right? It's not a very positive tone. And the way to mitigate that kind of thing, as a lot of people did, is I'm gonna use a pointer, is to sort of make it sound a little more neutral, right? Just saying like studies have shown, right? You know, just the hospitality and changing, avoiding, removing that you, right? But I really like this answer here. With many options available to consumers, people might be surprised to learn how fierce the competition in the hospitality industry is. It sounds a little bit nicer. I would say another thing you can do is this would be a great place to insert numbers, right? Talk about, like, you can just including some statistics to sort of prove that claim, right? Instead of just taking it for granted.
Are those
Because,
all the answers?
I think there are a few more down below. Yeah, see, that's perfect, yeah, see, hospitality industry is considered to be one of the most up to top 3 competitive industries in business, right? As long as you have the numbers to prove it, it's good to make those specific claims.
Need to put your source.
Yeah, and include your sources, yes. According to the US Department of Labor, right, showing that, you know, I'm not just, you know, this isn't just my opinion, right? I'm getting facts and research and data to back that up. Yeah, a lot of really, really good answers. Yeah, I think this next one is the last. And then I think we can move to the QA after this. what I think is nice about this example is it shows like different styles, right, different ways of approaching it. The original sentence was a little bit generic, right? So everyone got to sort of take it and sort of change it up, spice it up, put their own voice in it, right? You know, add some specifics, talk about sort of change how it's worded, right? Talk about your specific team. I think it's interesting, when faced with something like a little bland, right? How to sort of make it more interesting, even just to read, right? No one likes to read, bland reading all the time. So if there are places where you can sort of spice it up, just make it nicer to read, that can be helpful in and of itself. So I believe. Even on Mondays, did I miss?
On the left.
Right next to that.
Oh, yes, even on Monday, yeah.
Cute.
And then I believe. We'll skip that one. So now Q&A, so if you have a question, you can either speak up now, or those on Zoom, if you have a question, you can type it out and it will be